Today we are going to discuss the module on dams and the environment. Dams are one of the key infrastructure that has been deemed to help in the modernization of the country. The environmental consequences, the significant negative environmental consequences have been debated for a long time, but the legal framework that surrounds those environmental consequences has been relatively weak or not sufficiently implemented. Hence, there are many issues that need to be debated. Now, what is the context for what we're talking about? Dams were an engine of development in OECD countries for a number of decades. Progressively, after the end of the Second World War, that desire for building dams slowly declined up to the point where by the 1970s, when the environmental movement had started in full strength and when environmental law has started developing, at least at the national level, there was one famous case, as in that has become famous in the meantime in the United States, where a dam that had already been built was stopped from being commissioned because it was going to affect, namely lead to the extinction of an endemic species, so known as the snail darter, that was endemic to that area only. So that's kind of the end of dams in OECD countries in terms of the big push for building big dams and understanding dams mostly as an engine of progress rather than as an engine of progress and having significant environmental as well as in certain cases social consequences. Now, in the South, a converse trajectory was followed in the sense that it's from the 15th and 60s onwards that dams started being seen as an engine of development and modernization. And that's nowhere best visualized than in the statement of the first Prime Minister, Pandit Nehru, who said at a relatively early phase in the post-independent era that dams should be seen as the new temples of India. As we know, that's a statement that was subsequently revised, but the fact is that we are still talking about it today, and the fact is that that was a very significant moment in terms of the way in which dams were looked at in the process of nation building. What were dams first advertised or planned for in the post-independence period? First of all, and overwhelmingly for food security. So in other words, it's the irrigation rationale that justified the building of the various dams that started being planned after independence. A secondary aim was hydropower, so that from the start there was often a hydropower component, but that was generally subsidiary to the food security rationale, in other words, the irrigation rationale. Over time, that is at least since the 1980s onwards, and progressively much more so, drinking water has also become a rationale in itself for building dams, and we now have dams that are built primarily to satisfy drinking water needs. Now, one of the issues is that dams have been debated for a long time, but the debates around dams have focused largely on costs and benefits. In other words, in a largely economic analysis of what a dam brings to the country, what are the kind of benefits that can be expected compared to the cost of building the infrastructure and operating the infrastructure. What has been discussed much less are the legal dimension of dam building, and in particular of the negative consequences arising from the building of large dams. Now, what is a law and policy framework within which we can look at the environmental dimensions of dam? There are instruments that apply specifically to dams, but there are few of them, and there are some instruments that include dams in their scope, in a scope that will include other issues or other forms of infrastructure, for instance. In an environmental context, the main point of contact between dams and environmental law has been, for a long time, environmental impact assessment. Environmental impact assessment is not a dam-specific environmental law instrument, but in fact, it is very significant that the EIA was kickstarted in a dam context in the late 1970s, and the first legal instrument that was put out by the Ministry of Environment and Forest in the 1980s was, as in concerning environmental impact assessment, was the guidelines for environmental impact assessment of river valley projects. It's only in the 1990s that environmental impact assessment was made a statutory requirement in the context of the EIA notification of 1994. This does not apply only to dams, but it was a very important step because it did include dams as part of its scope, and the clearance requirements that were included in the notification were a major step forward in terms of recognizing that dams needed to be assessed not only from a cost-benefit perspective, but also from an environmental perspective per se, without looking at the other issues together. Now, the EIA notification of 1994 may have been insufficient in its own right. It was largely seen in the sense as the first step in the building of a regulatory framework, but in historical hindsight, we can now tell that it appears as the high point of regulation in this field, because the general trend after 1994 has been rather towards a weakening of the framework that was put in place then, rather than strengthening it. So this is as far as the environmental impact assessment and dams is concerned. Another element which needs to be taken into account in terms of legal frameworks is the Forest Conservation Act. The reason for this is because dams also affect sometimes forested areas, in which case the stipulations concerning the diversion of forest to non-forest purposes need to be followed. There are various other laws that are also relevant. One which is very directly relevant, even though it does not really focus on dam per se, is the Interstate River Water Disputes Act of 1956. It's, as the name implied, about water disputes, but the fact is that in practice, the disputes that have arisen have often been related to dams and the potential for dams to allocate or reallocate water away from the river or from an interstate river. Another stream of legislation that's relevant are all the irrigation acts we have in the various states of the country. Irrigation acts are not dam specific at all, but all the irrigation acts we have until now are driven by the needs of surface irrigation through canal systems fed by dams, and in that context are very much directly related to dams, even though they don't talk the dam language directly.